Supposed to get more this morning.
Yeah, I'd like to see us get a good inch.
Psalm 78 is where we're going to start this morning. 78, where we really assign 71 through 78. 78 is a very long psalm. And so I wanted to cover that one. I think it's the most significant one of the ones we were studying. Then, if we have time, we might go back and pick up at 71 and get some of the highlights from the rest of the Psalms. This teaching is entitled, Dark Sayings of Old. Psalm 78, give ear, O my people. We're the people of God, are we not?
Amen.
The people of God, we're the church. That's the people of God, the body of Christ. So we need to give ear. What is the Spirit saying unto the churches? We give ear, and God speaks to us individually, and God speaks to us corporately. He might say things corporately in a church service or Bible study that we would not hear individually. But it's important that we hear from God and we seek God. We got to give ear to Him. Listen. In other words, listen up. I will open my mouth in a parable. A parable is a story to illustrate spiritual truth, a short story usually, simple story. Jesus taught in parables. His parables are very simple stories or riddles. It can also be translated. I will utter dark sayings of old, hidden sayings. Now these are hidden sayings that he is revealing now through the psalm, which we have heard and known. And our fathers have told us, even though they're hidden sayings, we say, you know these things. A lot of these things the Bible teaches we know intuitively. They're self-evident truths. Our fathers told them to us, so should have. Basic sayings on what is right and what is wrong, on the history of the family, on the history of the nation, on the history of the church you're connected with, the history of the business you may have. We will not hide from them which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us, we will not hide them from their children, showing to the generations to come the praises of the Lord and His strength and His wonderful works that He hath done. We need to remember, know our history, but have a vision to pass on our history to generations that will come. Gentlemen, we should be thinking beyond just our children, our grandchildren, maybe even some of us that might be at the great-grandchildren stage. We need to think beyond even that. We have a history to pass on. We have truth to pass on. We have an experience to pass on. We will not hide them from our children. Well, we hide them if we don't tell it. I know my mother, before she passed, spent a lot of time putting together the family history, putting it in a book. I often refer to it because it's so easy to forget. My aunt on another side of the family did the same thing on the Gilder side of our family. We will not hide them from their children, showing to the generations to come the praises of the Lord, the wonderful works of God, what He's done in our midst, and show His strength, His power. We serve a God of strength and power and might. He is our bulwark. He is our rock we keep getting these expressions in Psalms. For he has established a testimony in Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What was Jacob originally called? Oh, yeah, I mean, Jacob was originally called. What name did he take on? Israel. Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. He has established a testimony. And he's established a testimony in each and every one of us. And we need to relate our testimony and pass our testimony on to our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. And so they can say, well, I had this grandfather, he was a religious fanatic. That's okay. He established a testimony in Jacob, and he appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers. What is the law? The Ten Commandments. That's what he's talking about. We need to sit down and teach our children and our grandchildren the Ten Commandments. Our granddaughters were here, and of course we had the first visit from the 3-year-old granddaughter. I guess she's about 3 now. And so I was determined to teach her a prayer to say over grace, just simple prayer. And we went over it and wrote every morning. Wanted to teach that to her. Verse 6, that the generation to come might know them, even the children which should be born, who should arise and declare them to their children. That they might set their hope in God and forget not the works of God and keep his commandments. So we have a memory, and we need to cultivate our memory and pass on what we can remember to the next generation. We have a history. Each one of us have a history. We want to pass on that history of our family, of us individually, of our community. And we have hope. We ought to keep hope for the future. We need to be optimistic. I never known a pessimistic person to accomplish much in life. We need to be optimistic, that we can have a positive influence on the future. You know, we look at the circumstances and we watch the news, and things seem terrible, but really people I interact with, lead pretty good lives and decent lives. It's not necessarily the way we see it in the media all the time, and the way they want to represent it in Hollywood. And he says, forget not the works of God. We can't forget. We need to remember. It's easy to forget what God has done. We need to remember it. And we have a basis of hope, a reasonable hope, because we see and know what God has done for us in the past. A history lesson. Last week I talked about my trip to Washington, D.C. for the Salute to America by Donald Trump. And I've noticed Donald Trump in all of his speeches, and I try to listen to most of them when he has his rallies and so on, always gives a history lesson. I like that. And he started with a history lesson when he gave his speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. I want to read to you a few highlights of that speech. As we gather this evening in the joy of freedom, we remember. That's what the psalmist said. Remember, don't forget. We remember that we all share a truly extraordinary heritage. Extraordinary heritage of the United States of America. We have that in common. And we need to remember it and pass it on. Together we are part of one of the greatest stories ever told. I like that. One of the greatest stories ever told, the story of America. It is the epic tale of a great nation whose people have risked everything for what they know is right and what they know is true. Risked everything for what is right and what is true. It is the chronicle of brave citizens who never give up on the dream of a better and brighter future. This element of hope that the psalmist speaks about. We have a better and a brighter future. This is a theme that I notice Trump really hits. It hits regularly. Our best days are in the future. Not in the past, but in the future. And it is the saga of 13 separate colonies that united to form the most just and virtuous republic ever conceived. On this day, 243 years ago, our founding fathers pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their what? Lives, their fortunes, and their what? Sacred honor. Sacred honor. We're to be honorable men. We don't hear too much about being honorable anymore. But these were honorable men that founded our country, that signed the Declaration of Independence. And they knew, of course, if they lost the war, that what would probably have happened to John Hancock and the rest of them.
Be hanged.
They'd be hanged. They'd been dead. They knew that. They understood that. They were willing to risk that, pledging their lives, their fortunes. They were, many of them, men of means. But their sacred honor. You can lose your life. You can lose your fortune. But you don't want to lose your sacred honor, brethren. That's one thing you want to make sure you don't lose. Our lives are expendable. Our wealth, our prosperity, our money is expendable. But our honor is not. To declare independence and defend our God-given rights. Our politicians don't speak so much of inalienable rights anymore. These are natural rights or God-given rights. They speak about civil rights. We've heard a lot about civil rights since the 60s. What are civil rights? Well, civil rights are rights defined by civil government. Well, our rights aren't granted or bestowed by civil government. They're birthrights. They're God-given. They're inalienable. They cannot be taken away. But if it's government that bestows rights, the same government that bestows your right, what can happen later? Take that same right away. So we need to understand and tell our children these are God-given rights. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And then he goes on and gives a speech, and he gave a history of each branch of the military, of course. And then he concluded, we will never forget that we are Americans, and the future belongs to us. And I can imagine Moses and Joshua and the kings and David himself, and said, well, we're Israelites. God brought us out of Egypt with mighty signs and miracles and wonders. He parted the Red Sea. He brought terrible judgments on Egypt, killing the firstborn of Egypt. But any Israelite who would kill a lamb and put the blood on the doorpost, that family was saved and not lose its firstborn. They were constantly relating this history. And Americans have forgotten their history. I remember my history teacher. You must have had the same one I did, Rick, Mr. Latta. Did you have Mr. Latta for American history? Yeah. I remember Mr. Latta used to spend 6 weeks Studying the Constitution. Going through the Constitution line by line. We had to keep a notebook. And, turn in the notebook at the end of 6 weeks. I doubt a lot of these politicians in Washington, D.C., I doubt most of these congressmen or senators have ever even read the Constitution through. Or the Declaration of Independence, probably, for that matter. We will never forget that we are Americans and the future belongs to us, Trump said. The future belongs to the brave, the strong, the proud, and the free. We are one people chasing one dream and one magnificent destiny. We all share the same heroes, the same home, the same heart, and we are all made by the same Almighty God. These are the words of our president. The spirit of American independence will never fade, never fail, but will reign forever and ever. I like that. This is the theme of Psalms. It's the theme of the writers in the Bible, constantly relating, in their case, of course, not the history of America, but the history of Israel. But our founding fathers and our Pilgrim Fathers thought we were the new Israel. Read their writings. They regarded America as the new Israel. The nation that God was working in and through in a particular and peculiar way as he did Israel of old.
See, Jed, in the earlier Psalms, a lot of them were of David, and we had a few in this lesson of Solomon. This of A-S-A-P-H, what's that mean?
Well, this is a musician, evidently. Probably someone in the court. I looked some of these up. I don't think anybody really knows. That's all we know is about him. It's just his name here. So yes, this one, but it is, I'm glad you brought that out, because this one isn't one evidently written by David himself, but someone in David's court, another musician. Psalmist, poet, prophet. Okay, back to Psalm 78 now, in verse 8. Talking about what kind of people they're supposed to be. Trump affirming that. And be not as their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation. We're not to be that way. A generation that set not their heart on right, but set their heart on doing wrong. Set their heart on sinning. And whose spirit was not steadfast with God. We need to have a steadfast spirit. Stand fast. Whatever comes our way, whatever difficulties, whatever tests, whatever trials come our way, we need to stand. Having our loins girt about with the truth, putting on the helmet of salvation, the whole armor of God, the breastplate of righteousness, have our feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace, the shield of faith, by which we can quench all the fiery darts of the wicked, the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. Steadfast spirit. The children of Ephraim was the son of Joseph. Joseph was the son of Jacob, or Israel. And it was Joseph who went down into Egypt, remember? The children of Ephraim, being armed and carrying bows, turned not back in the day of battle. Now, I don't know, I can't think of any exact historical reference they're talking about. I think they're talking about the spiritual battle here that we're all engaged in. We're engaged in spiritual warfare. And so they had the arms, but they did not use it. We got to use what God has given us. We got to exercise the power and authority that God has given us. We have to engage the enemy. It was one of Lincoln's difficulties, and he couldn't find any general that wanted to really engage the South, engage the enemy. George Meade was, knew how to train troops very well, and he had them all well trained, but he never wanted to go to battle. And this is the difficulty Lincoln had of finding a general, and he tried one after another until he found Grant. And Grant was a warrior, Grant was a fighter, Grant was ready to go and risk the lives of his men, and he brought victory. So we have to be armed, the full armor of God. I talked about that. Carrying bows. They turned back in the day of battle. We're engaged in the battle. We don't want to turn back. We don't want to give up. We want to engage ourselves. We talk about who are our enemies. We're Christians who have enemies. It's more than just people. What are some of the enemies? We mentioned this last week, that we have to face. Attacks from the devil, demons, sickness. These are our enemies. Disease is our enemy. Death is an enemy. That's the last enemy that's going to be destroyed, is death. We want to take a stand against him, not give up, not give in. Not give in to our feelings, but yield to the Spirit of God. Ask God, strengthen me to get through this day. Keep me going, Lord. Depression can be an enemy. Sometimes our enemies within our own family. So we all face enemies, hopelessness, discouragement. These are all enemies that will come against us, try to destroy our witness, being forgetful, not remembering our heritage, not passing it on, not doing our duty to pass on truth to our children and our children's children. I have to say, my wife Cindy's really better at this than I am. Of passing on, sitting the grandchildren down and, talking to them about spiritual things, about the Lord, and praying with them, and teaching them a little bit of history, and from not just political history of the United States, family history, local history, whatever. We have a perspective on life, gentlemen, that's valuable, that age gives us, that we need to pass on and relate to the next generation. Say they weren't brought up with Mr. Ladd who will spend 6 weeks on the Constitution. They're not going to get that in the schools today. There were the rebels. There was always the rebels. Typically, God spoke of Israel as a remnant. There was a faithful remnant throughout their history. Now, remnant doesn't have to be that small, but it can be kind of a big, still it's smaller than the big piece of cloth, the remnant of cloth. They kept not the covenant of God and refused to walk in his law. Whether we're going to obey God or disobey God, it's a choice. We can refuse to do what's right, or we can choose to do what's wrong. It's our choice. And they forgot his works. See, memory has to be cultivated. We have to concentrate on remembering. I think some people, I'm not saying this is always the case, but I think in some cases, people don't have good memories. Went through bad marriages and this sort of thing. Forget about that woman. I don't want to remember her. I don't want to remember him. But thankfully, when you got good memories, it's easy to remember. And you know, and there's a certain blessing is we do have a tendency, or at least I find myself, I try to concentrate on remembering the good and forgetting the bad. We've all had bad things that have happened. We've all done bad things. You know, put that behind us. Forget about that. Remember what's good. There's a lot of good. Concentrate on that. And passing that on. What's good. What's pleasant. What's delightful. What's challenging. What's inspiring. That's what we want to pass on. Verse 12, marvelous things did he in the sight of their fathers, in the land of Egypt, in the field of Zoran. Marvelous things. And again, that's what Trump talked about, marvelous things our military has done in our various wars, and heroes, and men have gotten the Medal of Honor. And you go out to Arlington. We went out to Arlington. They talked about the big hero who is probably one of the most heroic persons, soldiers in our history. Maybe got the most medals. World War II. You know him.
Pat Murphy.
Audie Murphy. Audie Murphy. And they talked about him a lot. Marvelous things. Sergeant York, World War I. Trump referred to Sergeant York. Marvelous things did he in the sight of their fathers, in the land of Egypt, in the fields of Zoan. Zoan, the fields of Zoan, that was a part of Egypt where the Jews lived. You know, they were enslaved there. In Goshen. He divided the sea and caused them to pass